welcome if you were unable to join that one. I'm about to give a very streamlined, but I think comprehensive summary of the first principles, as I called them, of the Jewish conception of social justice that we covered during the first session. And then we will move on to the source sheet for my second session. And this is, as I mentioned last Sunday, the final session. I'd hoped to have three, but had to cut back. As you'll see in just a moment, I've entitled this second session Amplification of First Principles. So we talked about some of the first principles and primary underlying values of the Jewish conception of social justice last week. This week, we're going to focus most of our attention on the elaboration, the amplification, and spelling out of those principles in the later classical tradition by the rabbis of both the rabbinic period in the first few centuries of the Common Era, and then through the medieval period. We'll look at a few modern touches as well. So the agenda for this session is to show how the first principles that we discussed last week and that I'm about to summarize became the focus of much attention and energy in spelling out in much precision the details of those principles so that they could be actualized in Jewish society and not simply recalled as abstract principles, but instead could be translated into concrete behavior. So what were those first principles that we talked about last time? Some of them are very familiar to us, but in combination, I think they inform what we're referring to during these sessions as the Jewish notion or conception of social justice. The first is that all of us, everyone, and there are really no exceptions, all of us were created in the divine image. That notion is established immediately at the beginning of the book of Genesis, of Bereshit. I think there are different readings of the beginning of the book of Genesis, but my reading is that was not accidental, that was a purposeful, universalistic opening to what became a much more particularistic book, that meaning not just Genesis, but the Torah itself, obviously then focuses on a particular Jewish family and Jewish tribes and Jewish people as they became enslaved and then emerged to march toward the promised land. But I think it is intentional that the opening of the book of Genesis is universalistic. And the most universalistic idea embedded at the beginning of the book of Genesis is that all peoples, all human beings were created in the image of God. And secondarily, but crucially related to that, is the fact that all of us, all humanity, not just the Jewish people, but all humanity shares a common historical pedigree, that we were all descended from a common ancestor, or Adam, or let's say, reading it a little more broadly, from a common set of parents. We saw some rabbinic texts last week that focused very closely on that issue, that God intended creation to develop in that way, so that one people could not say to another, I have a better pedigree than you do. We all have a common ancestry. And as a result of all of us being created in the divine image, and all of us having a common ancestry, all of us, every human being, is entitled to a certain level of dignified treatment that I think really is the foundation of the Jewish conception of social justice. So that twin concept of divinity within us and the fact that we all share a common humanity leads in the Jewish theory of justice to a logical conclusion that we all should treat each other with an equal measure of dignity and respect, righteousness and justice. But the first principles go beyond that. God, we saw several texts, both from the Torah and more broadly from the Tanakh, from the prophetic tradition, that established that God's essential attributes are justice and righteousness. And I said for the Hebrew speakers and readers, and for everyone in terms of listening to the Hebrew words that I think denote concepts of justice and righteousness that are paired together are tzedek, stacca, mishpat, chesed. There are nuances of difference among them, and they actually can mean different things in different textual settings. But those are the words that I think give rise in the aggregate to a Jewish conception of social justice. And God, his own attributes embody those traits. Many texts in our tradition establish that. And further, another logical step is that we have a religious obligation. That the subtitle of my class generally is Social Justice as Divine Imperative. Social justice is not a matter of our gracious whim or our voluntary or arbitrary conduct. It is a function of divine commandments to us, a broad command to establish justice in the world, which itself is constituted of many other commandments that seek to establish how we go about actualizing that broader mandate. But social justice in the world that we strive to establish is a function of mitzvah, of commandedness, and the way we go about doing that is that we try to imitate God's own attributes of justice and righteousness. So that imitation of God establishes our pathway for justice in the world. We also saw there are many instances, I only brought a few of those, but literally dozens of instances in the Torah that reflect God's own preoccupation through the actualization of God's justice and righteousness in the world, preoccupation with the marginalized, the vulnerable, the weak in our society. Again, dozens of verses in the Torah establish that fact. And we focused in particular on a few texts that demonstrate that God's concern for the ger, for the stranger, who in the Torah is not a convert and was a resident alien who was not, at least not fully Jewish, establishes that we, in imitating God, should also care for the vulnerable, the weak, and the stranger. So the scope of social justice presumably extends beyond our own Jewish community. Finally, two related components or principles of social justice are, in our tradition, the mandate to be holy, Kedoshim Tihiyu, that you shall be holy, which is God's directive to us, is comprised of very specific and concrete conduct. It's not an abstract, illusory notion that is beyond our grasp, but it is embodied and actualized in concrete behavior that we can actually engage in this world. Having said that, we saw that within the prophetic tradition, there is the notion that perhaps the perfect fulfillment of our mandate to establish justice in the world may have to await the Messianic period, that there our realization of the ideal of justice in the world may be imperfect in this world, and concrete behavior is not beyond our grasp, but perhaps perfect actualization of justice will be, and we'll get back to that theme. But certainly the tradition encourages us, and indeed, as I said just a moment ago, commands us to seek, to strive to actualize justice and righteousness in the world in our imitation of God's own attributes. So those are I think many, I was going to say some, but I think those are most of the first principles that underlie the Jewish conception of social justice. Today, As I mentioned, we'll discuss how those first principles were elaborated, amplified, made even further concrete by the rabbinic tradition in the many centuries that followed. And we'll see that social justice is a mandate for both individuals and for the community more generally. But all of that was meant to demonstrate that the negation of injustice in the world and the promotion of justice should be one of our greatest concerns and one of our chief obligations. This, I think it's indisputable that social justice construed broadly, which I think the tradition does, it encompasses many or most aspects of what is within the domain of Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, our interactions with each other. This is really important stuff. So the tradition spends a lot of time figuring out how to teach us to actualize that ideal in this world. And as I said last time, and we can only sort of touch on this topic, but the Talmud literally spends tractates on the details of fulfilling the mandate to be just and fair and dignified to each other. So with that, I'm going to share my source sheet. Okay, so as I mentioned, this session is entitled Amplification of First Principles. And before actually we get into the rabbinic amplification of those principles, I just want to pause before we do that and focus on what is a problematic text in the Torah. There are several problematic texts in the Torah that challenge at least our contemporary notion of social justice and of ethical treatment of other people. I'm focusing in the first text here, a text from Deuteronomy, and one that is a bit more obscure, but I think really captures this tension that sometimes exists between our contemporary notions of justice and righteousness and the reality of the world of the Torah, and reflects sort of the messiness, one could say, of actualizing these ideals in a world that is filled with unequal distribution of power, of status, of privilege, and of resources. And I think the Jewish tradition and many other traditions as well, but certainly the Jewish tradition focuses on how to deal, how to address those imbalances so that we can deal with each other on a more equal and dignified basis. So this text from Deuteronomy says, when you take the field against your enemies, so that the context here is a war, and the Lord your God delivers them into your power, so victorious battle, and you take some of them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire her and would take her to wife. And so that in the Hebrew, in the third line, it's Eshet Yafat Toar. So this is sort of the case of the beautiful woman of the opposing camp. You shall bring her into your house, and she shall trim her hair, pare her nails, and discard her captive's garb. She shall spend a month's time in your house, lamenting her father and mother. After that, you may come to her and possess her, and she shall be your wife. Then, should you no longer want her, you must release her outright. You must not sell her for money. Since you had your will of her, you must not enslave her. So just a few things I wanted to point out about this. Again, this whole situation may grate against our contemporary view of how people should deal with each other, but I think it reflects the reality of the ancient Near East. And in many respects, the Torah improves the treatment of the marginalized relative to the context in which the Torah was revealed or developed. And I want to point those out. So what we discussed last time was that the Torah is, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Torah is almost literally obsessed, at least very preoccupied with making sure that we express concern and are engaged in behavior that shows concern for the marginalized, for the weak, for the vulnerable in society, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, those people who are on the margins of society who may be defenseless or weak in terms of being able to maintain their own dignity. We have to make sure that we accord them the dignity that they deserve as creatures created in the divine image and with whom we share a common pedigree. So the first principle is that everyone fashioned in the image of God is entitled to dignified treatment. But we have to show special concern for the marginalized. But here's a text that shows that there are sort of limits to that concern, because it assumes that there is an imbalance of power between the person addressed by the text, which is, I think, clearly a male, and this woman, this beautiful woman, taken captive. So the backdrop to the text can be troubling to us on many levels, ethically, in light of our contemporary perspective. But the Torah, I believe, does go out of its way to try to enhance the protections afforded to this woman. There are different readings of this, but one is in verse 11, which says, you see a beautiful woman. Verse 12 goes on to say that you should try to make her less appealing, I think, so that she becomes less vulnerable to your exploitation, so that the woman perhaps can escape the treatment that you have in mind for her. Verse 13 then goes on to say, but give her a month's time to mourn for her family from whom she is now separated. And only after a month's time, and perhaps after a month's time, the captor may lose interest, which perhaps is another way of trying to salvage the situation for the captive woman. And finally, in verse 14, if he has his way with her, but no longer desires her, you can't. The man can't sell the woman into slavery and must release her. So there are, despite the fact that she is subject to sort of his whim and his control, there's clearly an imbalance of power here. The Torah places, I think, helpful constraints on his ability to exploit her. So I think this is a useful, even if obscure, but useful example within the Torah itself of the messy reality of trying to actualize justice. Over the centuries, hopefully we've improved in our ability to create gender equality, surely, but equality among human beings more generally that prevents situations like this. But I think we have to credit the Torah with seeking to elevate our ethical obligations beyond those that existed at the time. Okay, so I started with that sort of messy reality, but we're going to move beyond that and see how ethical standards became translated by the tradition. And before we do that, I just want to read a quote from Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the great Jewish philosophers of the 20th century, and in many ways a preacher and prophet of our time. And I just wanted to make very clear the point that came up last time, that when we think of social justice in a Jewish perspective, I don't mean by that simply justice in the courtroom. Judicial justice is an aspect, a species of social justice more generally. And I know we talked about sort of being reluctant to define social justice last time. I'm less reluctant now because I think the Jewish tradition thinks of it very broadly. Social justice means the dignified treatment that we are obligated to afford each other within various social contexts in which we interact. And Heschel said, this is actually a speech he gave, most of us are content to delegate the problem to the courts as if justice were a matter for professionals or specialists, such as civil rights litigators. And they did great work, but their work is not sufficient for all problems. But to do justice is what God demands of every man and every person. It is the supreme commandment and one that cannot be fulfilled vicariously. So Heschel is elevating it as I think there is a basis in the tradition to do to make it perhaps the most important commandment, and tells us we can't leave the work to others. Righteousness must dwell not only in the places where justice is judicially administered. I just wanted to bring that quotation to make very clear, or to remind us that courtroom justice is only one type of social justice that the tradition focuses on. Okay, so we're going to now turn to the primary focus of the session on rabbinic amplification of principles. And this text 3 from Pirkei Avot is very famous. Shimon the righteous was one of the last of the men of the great assembly, the Beit Knesset Hagdolah. He used to say the world stands upon three things: the Torah, the temple service or service, worship more generally, and the practice of the acts of piety. So al ha-Torah, al ha-Avodah, al gemilut chasadim. And what I'm focused on in this course is the third, gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. As I mentioned earlier, chesed, the Hebrew word chesed, is a signifier of justice that is practiced by both God and by his commandment to us, by his people, the Jewish people. These three things are vitally important. I think this text from Pirkei Avot can be understood in at least two ways. One is that the world's continued existence hinges on our fulfillment or our engagement with these three elements of life: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. Or perhaps it intends to tell us that the very purpose of creation rested on these three predicates, that the world was created for the very purpose of our engaging in them. I note that there is another text from Pirkei Avot that I didn't bring, but Pirkei Avot later in chapter 1 references three other things that are most important in the world, and those are, not surprisingly, Din, which refers to justice, Emet, which is truth, and Shalom, peace. And one could say that those three are sort of the three bases or foundations of an orderly social contract among people, to use a more modern philosophical term. So the rabbis were engaged in the process of elaborating and amplifying on first principles and creating many precise and detailed rules and regulations about how we should engage in everyday conduct in fulfilling the mandate to be socially just toward each other. But they also had an inclination to try to distill the Torah down to its very basic tenets. This is one example. Last week we saw the debate between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Azai about the most important verse in the Torah. Just to remind you, we often invoke Rabbi Akiva's view that it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. I tried to argue that I thought Ben Azai's view that the most important verse is that God relates the generations of Adam, that we are all traceable to the common ancestor of Adam. I thought that was an even more comprehensive and compelling argument. But these are the types of texts that reflect the rabbi's inclination to try to distill the Torah down to its foundational principles. Here is another rabbinic texts. This is also famous. There was another incident involving one Gentile who came before Shammai and said to Shammai, "Convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot." And basically Shammai said, no, go away. He had no patience for him. The same Gentile came before Hillel. Hillel converted him and said to him, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to another. That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study." Zohi kol ha-Torah kula. It should sound familiar because I just mentioned that Rabbi Akiva after Hillel, so Hillel actually came before Akiva and said this first. Akiva said, "Love your neighbors as yourself" is the foundational verse in the Torah. Hillel is not quoting a verse, but it's really the flip side of "love your neighbor as yourself." And one could argue that "love your neighbor as yourself" is sort of hard to pin down. The Torah and the Jewish tradition more generally usually doesn't mandate feelings. And that "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha" is one of the few exceptions. Hillel turns it around and tries to, I believe, focus on conduct, that simply refuse to engage in the sort of harmful or hateful conduct that you would like to avoid others engaging in towards you. And that is the essence of the Torah. So it's less amorphous, I think, than the "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha" command. And it's more practical, enforceable, and translatable. Okay, I want to turn now to what is perhaps a less familiar text in rabbinic literature. I'm going to make this a little smaller so we can see more of it. This is a dispute, as we'll see, and I just want to outline it first before I read it, a dispute between Rabbi Akiva and someone named Turnus Rufus, who was a Roman general. So this is in the 2nd century, and Turnus Rufus was thought of as the evil one because he later put Rabbi Akiva and others through much suffering and ultimately death. He was the Roman general, but also the governor of the Judean province. So he was thought to be responsible for the tragedy that resulted from the Jewish rebellion at the time. But this debate between the two, so between the great Jew Akiva and the embodiment of the Roman Empire, Turnus Rufus, I think is really interesting and important. And I don't think we should discount the sort of the utility of engaging in the argument that Turnus Rufus promotes here. I'll read this. It is taught in a Braita, that's a rabbinic statement. Rabbi Meir would say, an opponent may bring an argument against you and say to you, if your God loves the poor, for what reason does God not support them himself? Now that's a really good question. It's a question of theodicy, of trying to rationalize the existence of evil and suffering in the world. It's a tough question with respect to God's allowance of poverty and other types of suffering in the world. And Meir counsels, in such a case, say to the opponent or to the critic of Judaism, he commands us to act as his agents in sustaining the poor, so that through them we will be credited with the performance of mitzvot, of commandments, and therefore be saved from the judgment of Gehenna, so that we will be saved from essentially from hell, from a terrible decree by God, because God has withdrawn a bit from the world and commanded us, as opposed to God himself, to perform philanthropy and charity, Stacca, and chesed, gemilut chasadim, social justice, one might say, in the world. God has withdrawn and allowed us to perform that so we could be credited with reward. And the Gemara, the Talmud goes on to say, and Rabbi Meir's question is precisely the one that Turnus Rufus the wicked asked Rabbi Akiva. And so Turnus Rufus, in the same words, if your God loves the poor, for what reason does he not support them himself? Rabbi Akiva responded, God commands us to sustain the poor so that through them and the charity we give them, we will be saved from the judgment of Gehenna, sort of mimicking Rabbi Meir. Turnus Rufus, not being a fool, responds, on the contrary, it is this charity, this stacca, this tzedek, and those are all words for justice and righteousness and ultimately for charity. It is this charity which condemns you, the Jewish people, to Gehenna because you give it. I will illustrate this to you with a parable. To what is this matter comparable? It is comparable to a king of flesh and blood who was angry with a slave and put him in prison in order that he should not be fed or given to drink. And one person went ahead and fed him and gave him drink. If the king heard about this, would he not be angry with that person? And you, after all, are called slaves, as it is stated, for the children of Israel are slaves to me, from Leviticus. So if God decreed that a certain person should be impoverished, one who gives him charity defies the will of God, is the logic of Turnus Rufus. Rabbi Akiva said to him, I will illustrate the opposite to you with a different parable. To what is this really comparable? It is comparable to a king of flesh and blood, so a human king who was angry with his son and put him in prison and ordered that he should, so not a slave, but his son, and ordered that he should not be fed or given to drink. And one person went ahead and fed him and gave him to drink. If the king heard about this, once his anger abated, would he not react by sending that person a gift? And by the way, Turnus Rufus, we Jews are called sons of God, as it is written, you are sons of the Lord your God, from Deuteronomy. Turnus Rufus, I'll try to shorten this a bit, says, well, you're called both sons and slaves. You're only called sons when you fulfill the will of God. And by giving charity to the poor, whom God apparently disfavors, you're not serving as sons, you're serving as slaves. And to that, Rabbi Akiva says, the verse states, so he ends the debate by citing another verse, this one from Isaiah, which purports to be dispositive of the debate and to win the debate on Rabbi Akiva's behalf. And we can question whether he really wins very definitively. But he cites a verse from Isaiah, which ends up, you see in the last couple lines, establishing that it is our obligation to share our bread with the hungry. So Rabbi Akiva, and the ground rules of the debate are you can cite biblical verses, and if you cite one as the coda to the debate, then you've won it, which apparently Rabbi Akiva, at least in the Talmudic perspective, has done. But I think this story, this Agadah, which perhaps has roots in history, makes clear that they're really competing perspectives about how we should interact with each other. The Roman perspective is that we really are not affiliated with one another. We're not accountable to one another. We have no obligations to help one another. And in fact, Turnus Rufus tries to say that's what God wants of us. God has disfavored certain people, those who are poor and hungry. That reflects the divine will. We're not entitled to contradict that divine will. And Rabbi Akiva, on the basis of the advice from Rabbi Meir, reflects the Jewish perspective that no, God has actually withdrawn a bit from the world, which, by the way, sort of hints at a mystical perspective of God's withdrawing from the world to allow our broader existence. But God has withdrawn it precisely in order for us to be allowed, and in fact, we are not just allowed, but mandated to share bread with the hungry, to engage in social justice, to protect the vulnerable. God wants that of us and will reward that conduct. So I think this narrative is important to reflect the alternative Jewish perspective about the function of charity in the world and the way we're supposed to interact with each other. And just to sort of distill that down to its essence, and I'm going to use masculine terms here, but I'm not at all intending to limit the scope of the statement, that I think it reflects the Jewish perspective that the fatherhood of God, so God sort of being our father, and we talk about that, and we use that term in the Hebrew as well, Avinu, our father, in our liturgy. The fatherhood of God is really predicated on the brotherhood of humanity, that one is can't exist without the other. They are inextricably intertwined. We have a vertical relationship with God. God makes commands of us, and we are obligated to fulfill those the mandates that he directs to us. But we also have a horizontal relationship with our fellow human beings. And the vertical and horizontal axes are both part of the fabric and structure of the Jewish conception of social justice. We have to think vertically about our obligations to God, but we also, and at the same time, have to think horizontally in terms of the duties that we owe our fellow human beings in terms of dignified, fair, and equal treatment before God. So I think this midrashic text from the Talmud is an important example of that competing Jewish perspective in the world. Okay, with those sort of preliminary texts behind us, some of you may be wondering why until right now, I haven't mentioned the Jewish phrase Tikkun Olam. I didn't mention it last time. That was the first time I mentioned it in this class, but I have purposefully avoided it. Some people these days in the 21st century, and it extended back to the 20th, used Tikkun Olam, that Jewish concept, as a proxy for social justice. I wanted to avoid that simple equation, primarily not because I think it is totally wrong-headed, but because the concept of Tikkun Olam itself is very complicated. It means different things in different Jewish historical periods and in different textual settings. And I'm about to discuss one of those settings, but it has not had a stable, consistent meaning. So I don't think it's particularly useful to use it as a proxy for social justice. I think there are better, more precise Hebrew words that capture the concept. But I did just want to mention Tikkun Olam so that you understand why I'm not focusing on it. This text is the second paragraph of Aleinu, which originally emerged within our liturgy for Rosh Hashanah, when we bow down, and we bow every day. And then it was incorporated into the daily liturgy. So this is something we say every day. This second paragraph is perhaps more obscure, less familiar, because we often mumble this paragraph. We sing in shul on Shabbat. We usually, not always, but we usually sing the first paragraph while sort of hurrying through the second one silently. But the second paragraph is at least as important as the first in terms of substance. And it says, "We therefore put our hope in you, God our Lord, to soon behold the glory of your might in banishing idolatry from the earth, and the false gods will be utterly exterminated, to perfect, establish the world as the kingdom of Shaddai." I bolded the relevant Hebrew words, letaken olam. So that's the infinitive version of tikkun, letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai. Letaken doesn't only or usually mean to perfect the world. I've included that as one of the English translations. It can also mean to fix, to repair, and also to establish. I think establish is probably the better sense of the Hebrew here, but it is this notion of Tikkun Olam, at least in the liturgy, that we say every day, is about the abolition of idolatry in the world with God's help. It's really a sort of a messianic vision. So Tikkun Olam here doesn't mean social justice, it means something else. Within rabbinic texts, it often means or refers to legislation that fixes a legal loophole, a halachic loophole. So it has meant different things in different settings. And in the mystical tradition, it means something else as well. But I just wanted to mention it because it is vocabulary that is often used by Jewish social activists and Jewish social justice thinkers. But I've avoided it generally because I think these other texts and these other terms are better suited to understanding the Jewish conception of social justice. Okay. With that, I'm going to turn to our next topic, which is an aspect of social justice. It doesn't exhaust the field by any means, but it is another aspect of it, which is Stacca, charity. I mentioned that the Jewish words of tzedek and Stacca within Tanakh really refer to righteousness and the fulfillment of our mandate to create justice in the world. In the Tanakh, it doesn't refer to charity. It eventually, later in our tradition, does or did come to mean philanthropy, in addition to its other nuances from earlier in the tradition. But I want to trace the development of the concept of justice. And I think it's really traceable to the few texts in the Torah, and I think this is a primary one from Vayikra, from Leviticus, that generally can be captured by the notion of payah, the mitzvah that we are to leave portions of our property for the poor. Leviticus says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of the field. Lo techale pe'at sadcha. So pe'at is the Hebrew variant of payah that I'm referring to. Pe'at sadcha liktzor, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. V'leket ketzircha lo telaket. You shall not pick your vineyard bare. V'charmecha lo te'olel uferet karmecha lo telaket. And you shall not gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. We're about to get to that in just a moment. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. So these are the marginalized, or these words are sort of the proxy for the marginalized within society. And note again, it includes the stranger, the resident alien who is not Jewish. It includes the ger, the stranger, within the scope of the mitzvah. But leave this this food on the margins of your fields and the fruit that has fallen, leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God. Ani Hashem Elokechem. And I noted last time, for example, here, this is a good illustration, but the most famous example of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you should love your neighbor as yourself, is immediately followed by Ani Hashem. I am the Lord your God. This too is another example of that. Being kind to the poor and the stranger in various ways, again, is not a function of our graciousness, our voluntary exercise of our goodwill. It is a divine imperative, a religious obligation, and God reminds us immediately in many of these contexts that I'm telling you to do this. And by the way, I am your God. I am directing you to do it. So this general notion of payah, we'll see is, or at least I'm including here, because many later texts within the Jewish classical tradition use payah and its related food gleaning related laws as the basis for many aspects of the Jewish structure, the Jewish systemic structure of Stacca, philanthropy. This is a rabbinic text. So we're moving from Leviticus to a Mishnaic text from the 2nd century or so. And if you recall above here, peret or ferret here was referenced in Leviticus. And so the Mishnah says, what is peret? Grapes which fall down during the harvesting to which the poor are entitled. And then very, very significantly, And very forcefully, the Mishnah says, one who places a basket under the vine when he is harvesting the grapes, behold, he is a robber of the poor. The Hebrew is Harei ze gozel et ha'aniyim. And then it quotes a verse from Proverbs that essentially reflects of sort of moving the stones that create boundaries between different property owners. If you move them, you're essentially stealing from your neighbor. In the same way, that if you try to prevent the grapes from falling to the ground so that they would become the property of the poor, you are essentially robbing the poor of food to which they are entitled. And I think what becomes very clear within the Jewish classical tradition is that even though property rights are very respected, and one is generally entitled to one's own property, that notion is mitigated through exceptions. And the Torah, including through the Jubilee year, the Yovel year in which land returns to its prior owner, but very poignantly in these contexts of leaving food for the poor. And this rabbinic text in particular is making clear that preventing the poor from accessing that food, you are robbing the poor of something to which they are entitled. So what is clear is that within the rabbinic tradition, although highly respected, property rights are not absolute. There is the sense that effectively all property belongs to God. God can redistribute property and food and resources and money as God sees fit. And God has seen fit to give us certain commandments that we should redistribute certain property and certain resources to the benefit of the marginalized in society. And just to be clear, there's no, at least I believe, there's no notion, there's no sort of socialistic notion within Judaism of that everyone has to have equal resources. That's absolutely not the case. It's certainly not reflected in the rabbinic tradition, but there is mandated and confined redistribution of resources to fulfill what is a commandment, that we have to make sure that the poor and other marginalized of society can maintain a dignified lifestyle. And so I've collected some rabbinic texts that make clear that our obligation to engage in philanthropy and Stacca, again, Stacca is related to tzedek, righteousness, justice. They are two sides of the same coin. They reflect and embody the same values. The rabbis spent much effort in making those obligations much more precise. So we don't simply have an amorphous obligation to be charitable. The rabbis went out of their way to create rules and regulations about how we go about doing that, how we go about being righteous, and how we go about actualizing social justice in our communities. This is a rabbinic text from the second or so century that reflects this mandated communal structure, that Stacca becomes obligatory. It's not voluntary. If one resided in the city 30 days, then one is regarded as a citizen of the city for assessments to support the communal charity fund, in Hebrew, kupah. And that's something we've incorporated into our modern usage in terms of the kupah, the Stacca boxes that we have in shul. For the clothing fund, the residence is 6 months. So before you're subject to the obligation to give to the clothing fund, you have to live in the community 6 months. For municipal taxes for services, 12 months residence. So even early in rabbinic times, from the second century or so, there are precise prescriptions for the obligations that an individual has to the collective communal obligation to create the structures and avenues of social justice within their communities. The Talmud, a little later on, makes this this institutionalization of municipal, what is really a municipal, and I'll describe it a little bit more, municipal welfare system. The rabbis have a fairly elaborate welfare system to make sure that the marginalized retain as much dignity as possible. In the Babylonian Talmud, it says, and it is taught in a Braita, so it's actually referring back to a fairly early rabbinic statement, a Torah scholar is not permitted to reside in any city that does not have these 10 things: a court that has the authority to flog and punish transgressors, and a charity fund for which monies are collected by 2 people and distributed by 3. So you see in the Hebrew, the kupah shel Stacca. So this is this communal charity fund. Just a quick note, the kupah in the rabbinic welfare system referred to sort of a weekly, the slightly longer term source of communal funds that were provided to the needy. What was called a tamchui, we'll see that this in just a moment, was a communal food kitchen that provided emergency relief. So there was the kupah on the one hand and the tamchui on the other. Both of those were resources as to which individuals in a Jewish community had an obligation to contribute. This wasn't, again, not a matter of charitable graciousness. And the Talmud specifies, these are the precise details that started to attend notions of charitable distributions, that they were collected by 2 people and distributed by 3. There was a sort of meticulous method of how to distribute the communal charitable funds. And then it goes on to say that sort of an orderly, civilized, and sacred Jewish city would also have a synagogue, a bathhouse, a public bathroom, a doctor, a bloodletter, a scribe, a slaughterer, and a teacher. So these are the 10 things that any orderly and law-abiding Jewish city should have within it. And one of those 10 things, the second one listed, is this kupah shel Stacca, a communal charitable fund. Maimonides, in his great code, the Mishnah Torah, so this is from the later medieval period. By this time, by the medieval period, these details had largely been worked out and established, that these elaborations or amplifications of the more amorphous notions of charity had been worked out. And Maimonides, the Rambam, writes, never have we seen or heard of a Jewish community that does not have a kupah for charity. But as for a tamchui, that's this food kitchen, there are places whose custom it is to have it and places that do not. And it goes on to say that the kupah was distributed every Erev Shabbat on Friday afternoon. They would distribute it, they would collect it and distribute it as from one Friday to the next. But by the medieval period, by the time of Maimonides, this standard of civilized and religiously mandated Jewish communal organizational life that provided resources for the needy had become fairly established and fixed, and this is for many centuries, really up until the Enlightenment and emancipation, when Jewish self-government began to be eroded. Within these tightly knit Jewish communities, these charitable institutions within these municipal government sectors had really been had become commonplace. The Rambam also says in the Mishnah Torah that in the same section about charity, we must be especially careful to observe the mitzvah tzedakah more so than any other mitzvah, for tzedakah is a sign of the righteous lineage of Abraham. And he goes on to say, and if someone is cruel and without compassion, then his lineage is suspect, for cruelty is only found among the idolatrous nations. And he quotes a verse. The Rambam continues, and if a brother does not show compassion for another brother, a Jew for another Jew, then who will have compassion for him? And I think this has sort of a modern feel, at least for me. And to whom can the poor of Israel look? To the idolatry, he asked rhetorically. Should we look to the idolatrous nations that hate us and pursue us? No, fellow Jews can only look to rely upon their brothers. So a couple of things about this. Maimonides is saying that the inclination to show empathy and to engage in acts of justice and righteousness, and to give toward the communal Stacca fund is actually sort of an ethnic marker, like a calling card, an expression of our bona fides as good Jews. And if you see someone who really lacks that sense of empathy and that inclination to show a willingness to engage in social justice toward other people, you have to wonder about their lineage. And I mentioned last time that the Jewish perspective on social justice and on charity in this context as a species of social justice, oftentimes, and particularly during the medieval period, was insular in nature and focused on the Jewish community, because they often had to worry about their very survival, and they certainly couldn't look to their non-Jewish neighbors for assistance. They had to rely on their own resources. Having said that, Maimonides nevertheless goes ahead in the Mishnah Torah and says, they meaning we Jews, provide for and clothe the poor of Gentiles along with the poor of Israel for the sake of peaceful relations. Despite the often insular focus of charity and social justice within the medieval Jewish world, Maimonides says that if there is opportunity or need, we also provide for the needy among the non-Jews, and he says to maintain peaceful relations among us. But I think Maimonides would also say it's an extension of the Torah's focus on the ger, on the stranger, and that those religious obligations extend to resident aliens, non-Jews with whom we may interact. Yet another important text from Maimonides, who has a lot to say about the rules and regulations, and about the theory more generally of Stacca within the Jewish tradition. Maimonides fairly famously has the idea that there are 8 levels of Stacca. So I wanted to make sure I included this because it's somewhat well known. There are 8 levels of Stacca, each one greater than the other. I'm not going to read it all, but I want to focus on at least a couple. The greatest levels, I mean, the highest level of our philanthropy, higher than all the rest, is to fortify a fellow Jew and give him a gift, a loan, form with him a partnership, or find work for him until he is strong enough so that he does not need to ask others for sustenance. So for Maimonides, and I think this is a common Jewish view, the greatest philanthropy one Jew can give another, or anyone, as we just saw it extends to non-Jews as well, is to give that person the resources to generate self-sustenance and financial independence so that they can get off the dole, so that they don't have to look to the communal fund indefinitely, and that at some point in the future they can stand on their own 2 feet. And Maimonides says that is the greatest form of Stacca, enabling someone to become not a recipient of a lot of charity, but among the givers. And let me just note, it is almost remarkable, but the Jewish law is, as a general sense, that the rabbis suggest, if you don't have a lot of money, you should give about 10% of your financial resources to Stacca. If you are richer, there is sort of a sense of a progressive tax that you should give more, up to 20% or more. If a rich person can afford more and still be able to support his or her family, then you can give more than 20%. But they do establish these sort of percentages as parameters for appropriate giving. But the ideal is that everyone is self-sustaining. But even within that notion, there is the law that, and it almost sounds absurd, but recipients of tzedakah, those who get welfare benefits, even they, even the poorest of the poor, are obligated to give something of their of what they receive to the communal fund. And I think that is to remind them and us all that we owe everything we have to God, and that even the poorest among us should be mindful of their connection to the divine. The next level, one level lower than this, is one who gives tzedakah to the poor and does not know to whom he gives, and the poor person does not know from whom he receives. And then he mentions the kuppah that we talked about a few minutes ago. So the anonymity of charity is also important. It's important to maintain and preserve the dignity of recipients so that they don't feel indebted. And that Jewish value of human dignity is really a framework for the spiritual edification and education of both sides, both the giver and the recipient, that both are engaged in this sacred mandate. Both of them can learn lessons from both the provision and receipt of tzedakah. Quickly take a look at this responsum of the Rashba from Spain in the 13th century. Rabbi Solomon ben Adret was a student of Nachmanides. A question was asked of him: may the court obligate the community to do tzedakah as a tax, or only as a voluntary gift? And it refers back to giving donations for building the tabernacle in the Torah. Rashba responds, and he's really following Maimonides in this way. Not all communities are alike on this question. Some collect voluntary gifts and some exact a tax. It is still an unsettled halachic debate, but the law is to my mind that each and every one must give according to their ability, for all are obligated to support the poor, and that obligation is in accordance with one's wealth from which we support the poor. So Rashba, I think, falls on the side of, yes, the community can actually legally coerce its constituents, its members, to give to the communal fund. Again, just reinforcing the notion that this is a religious obligation and not a voluntary act of graciousness. And finally, wanted to include the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law by Yosef Karo, which makes clear it is a positive biblical command to give charity according to one's means. And then he refers to the numerous bases of that. But basically, it's a Torah, a deoraita commandment, a mitzvah, to give charity according to one's means. And he says, and he who closes his eyes to giving charity is called wicked and is regarded as if he worships idols. One should take great heed in giving alms that he not be the cause of bloodshed, for the poor man in need may die before help reaches him if it is not offered quickly enough. So it can be a matter of life and death. But pikuach nefesh, the saving of life, is not really the basis of charity. It emerges from other principles. But there is a notion that some poor people are in such dire circumstances that if we don't help support them, their lives will be at stake. I'm going to skip this text from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, but I'll quickly note that he, the great modern Orthodox rabbi, he really developed the modern Orthodox movement in the 19th century. But Rabbi Hirsch basically says, well, I don't know about this notion of the poor, a poor person's entitlement to these funds of tzedakah, but it is certainly related. Says, for tzedakah, charity is the justice which gives to every creature that which God allots to it. And there is the notion that God means for us to help support the poor among us. I'm going to pause there and open it up for any questions or comments. I can just, let's see. Okay, so I want to pause fairly quickly and ask if anyone has any questions or comments to make before I move on. Yes, Diane.
So I was noting your comment about charitable organizations in the community, basically up until the Enlightenment. But it occurs to me that in America, particularly in New York, in the late 19th and early 20th century, Landsmannschaften were developed to take care of the people from the community who came from Kishinev or Berlin or wherever they came from. And they were charitable organizations that really took care of their own community within New York, for instance. So that continued into the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the sort of Jewish communal organizations that we have that organize our efforts to distribute resources to those who need them, those are definitely an outgrowth of those medieval structures. The difference that I wanted to highlight was during the medieval period, those communal structures had legally coercive measures that were designed to force people to give to those funds. And within those structures of Jewish self-government, a court could force someone reluctant to engage in Stacca to give what the community thought that person owed. So that's the difference, that with emancipation, the legally coercive measures of self-government started to be eroded, and eventually they disappeared. So, the structures that you referenced certainly exist; they still exist today. But the Federation can't force Diane Okren to give to the Jewish communal fund.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? I'm not sure I can see everyone, but if you have a question or comment, please feel free to unmute yourself. Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing anyone, so I'm going to move on.
I just wanted to say one thing. It seems to me, I don't know about all the different, I know about a lot of different charities, but it seems to me as though we should all be doing this jobs provision, jobs training and job providing to go along, with Maimonides, that should be, a real focus of Jewish tzedakah is, providing jobs. And I don't hear about that specifically. It could be that I just don't know about it.
Yeah, there may be others on the screen who know much better than I about what actually exists. But I wholeheartedly agree with you that I think that the traditional Jewish conception is that Stacca should elevate the recipient's capacity to be self-sustaining and to be financially independent, because, and that's a good goal in and of itself, but it has a religious dimension that through that self-sustenance, through that method of philanthropy, we are elevating that person's human dignity that we are religiously obligated to enhance, or at least to preserve, but in this case to enhance. So I agree with you that providing jobs to those in need, if the community can organize itself to facilitate that goal, would be a very worthwhile goal in light of the traditional conception of Stacca.
Mark?
Yes.
Yeah, what about, doesn't that exist in ORT, the Jewish organization for rehabilitation and training?
Yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, and Bert, you've just referenced an example of this. I don't know how widespread it is.
No, but it exists.
But it exists. Yeah,
Right.
I didn't mean to suggest it didn't. I just,
Fine, sorry.
you're reminding me of, or there may be others that deserve equal mention. But they are acting within sort of the best practices of classical Jewish theories of Stacca. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again. Okay. I'm going to try to end this session in time so that we have a few minutes worth of any additional questions or comments. So I have just a few sections left of text that I want to mention, or that I want to focus on. I'd like to turn to what I think is a good example, because there's an abundant supply of texts within our tradition that focus on one realm of social justice, which is labor justice. Social justice in the workplace. The workplace or work environments can be crucibles of interaction between people that reflect either inequalities of resources, of power, of status, of privilege, and of good or bad treatment. These are cutting edge issues today in terms of minimum wage debates and other issues relating to labor law. But the Jewish tradition goes back millennia in terms of its mandate for us with respect to proper treatment of fellow human beings. So that's sort of my definition of social justice, how we interact with each other in social frameworks. In terms of employer and employee relations, Leviticus 19 says, and listen carefully to the context, you shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. So the first two sort of clauses didn't mention the laborer, but the laborer is referenced right after the Torah says, don't defraud your fellow and don't commit robbery. And I think a very good inference is that withholding wages of a laborer until morning could constitute species of fraud or robbery, that the worker is entitled, and this is, one can think of low wage workers these days. These were day laborers who were not wealthy and who relied on their wages being paid promptly. And withholding their wages, the Torah is suggesting to us, would effectively constitute or be tantamount to defrauding the worker and robbing the worker of the wages to which he or she is entitled. I'll note, I'm not gonna get into this because it's fairly complicated, but the book of Deuteronomy actually says, pay the laborer at the end of the day. So we have some conflict, some contradiction, some tension between Leviticus and Deuteronomy about whether the employer can withhold wages until the morning or not. That is when payment has to be made, that same day or the next morning. But I'm not going to get into those details. Either way, you have to pay wages fairly promptly. And those are wages to which they are entitled. That the promptness of payment is something to which they are entitled. Deuteronomy says, you shall not abuse a needy and destitute laborer, whether a fellow countryman or a stranger in one of the communities of your land. So again, these labor laws that are within the realm, an aspect of social justice apply to the ger, the non-Jew as well. You must pay, and here is the Deuteronomy verse that I just mentioned. You must pay him his wages on the same day before the sun sets. So this requires even prompter payment by the employer, for he is needy and urgently depends on it. And God reminds us, else he will cry to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. So you will be punished if you don't fulfill this mandate, because again, God is almost obsessively concerned about the marginalized, and the marginalized in this context includes these day laborers who need their daily wages in order to exist. Now, in terms of amplification of first principles, this is a rabbinic text from the Talmud tractate Baba Kama that seeks to remedy what may be, or what often is, the imbalance of power as between the employer and the employee, the laborer and the boss. Rav says a laborer may retract his commitment to his employer even in the middle of the day, meaning a worker could quit in the middle of the day. As long as he did not retract his commitment, he is considered to be under the jurisdiction of the employer. And it quotes this verse that we've seen before from Leviticus that says, "For unto me, unto God, the children of Israel are servants. Ki li v'nei Yisrael avadim v'lo avadim la'avadim." That Jews cannot be servants to other Jews because we can't be servants to servants, meaning we're all servants of God. And God is trying to prevent this indentured servitude. Now, I know and I acknowledge there is indentured servitude in the Torah. I'm not going to get into that. It's a challenging and problematic topic that is too broad for this particular course. But in terms of laborers, this text in the Talmud is suggesting that a worker has control over his time and has discretion to quit in the middle of the day if he wants. But not surprisingly, the rabbinic tradition through the medieval period places constraints on the worker's ability to do that, because there has to be fair treatment both ways. There have to be reciprocal and mutual obligations of social justice flowing between the worker and the boss. It's not just, remember the Torah says in judicial, with respect to judicial rulings, don't favor the poor. There has to be equal treatment between the rich and the poor. And the rabbinic tradition tries to mediate this power relationship and make sure that in whatever circumstances may establish that one or the other is more vulnerable to exploitation, then the law will, the Halacha, the Jewish law, will protect that category of people. And in this case, the employer can also be protected. The Maimonides in his code Mishneh Torah says, a worker may quit his work even in the middle of the day. We just saw that. When does the above apply? With regard to work that does not involve an immediate loss. So if it is work that is the timing of which is crucial. So if the worker quits, the employer will be subject to damages. Then there are limitations placed on the worker's ability to quit, unless he's held back by forces beyond his control, illness or the death of a relative. So Maimonides makes clear the entitlement of a worker to quit in the middle of the day is not unlimited. We have to try to preserve the mutuality and reciprocity and rough equality between the employer and employed. So there are constraints on the worker's ability to quit in the middle of the day. And further, Maimonides goes on to teach us, and this really embodies Jewish law. He's not making up Jewish law, he's codifying Jewish law. Just as the employer is warned against robbing the wage of the poor workman and against delaying it. So that he's referring to the verses that we saw in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So reciprocally and mutually is the poor workman warned against robbing the employer by idling away his time on the job, a little here and a little there, thus wasting the entire day deceitfully. He must be scrupulous throughout the time of work. For this, and this is sort of almost a little bit funny, for this reason, the rabbi specified that workers do not need to recite the fourth blessing of Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, that because a worker is obligated to be efficient and productive and focused and diligent, they can get away with an incomplete Birkat HaMazon. Will allow them, even in matters of prayer and liturgy, to streamline their obligations there so that with respect to their employer, they can provide the employer with a fair workday. And he's supposed to be, a worker is supposed to work to the best of his ability. And Maimonides quotes Genesis that Jacob worked diligently and was made rich as a result. So that may happen to you too. But there are obligations on both sides. So, and I can only include, a few texts here, but there are tractates of the Talmud dedicated to establishing this mutuality, this reciprocity of obligations in different settings that are designed to either preserve or to enhance the equality between people, so that everyone can be subject to the dignified treatment to which they are divinely entitled. I'm going to conclude with a few texts that sort of muddy the situation a bit. This is from Deuteronomy. Do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, v'asita hayashar v'hatov be'inei Hashem, and will get rewarded as a result. I say it muddies the situation because I've just referred to the fact that the rabbinic tradition over many centuries and over voluminous texts of not just the Talmud, but commentaries on the Talmud and codices of Jewish law spends a lot of time and effort and pages on trying to establish the precise, the minute rules and regulations that will govern our conduct, so that we don't just have amorphous standards of behavior. We don't just have amorphous references to social justice and righteousness in the world, but that we'll know how to engage in conduct with respect to our fellow human beings to fulfill that divine mandate. But here's an example of a mandate from Deuteronomy that is amorphous and is treated by the subsequent tradition as amorphous, which makes the standards of behavior for us a little bit confusing and daunting. From that Deuteronomy quote, Nachmanides, many centuries later, but very authoritatively says, our rabbis have said that which is right and good. That refers to what we just read from Deuteronomy, refers to a compromise and going beyond the requirements of the letter of the law. In the Hebrew, this is a concept that I actually considered spending the entire class on this concept, lifnim meshurat hadin, which is hard to translate because lifnim means really within, but it's generally true. But the intent is that our behavior should go beyond the strict letter of the law, that we should act in a manner and we should inculcate values within our hearts and minds and within our behavior that reflect that we know that sometimes the strict letter of the law does not exhaust what God wants of us, that we have to go beyond it. And Nachmanides says, it's the scope, the universe of man's conduct is too broad, too massive for God to mention everything within the scope of social justice. So God reminds us, I'm giving you a lot of laws and commandments, but more generally, be just and good. Again, just like I, God, am myself, imitate me. And sometimes you have to go beyond the letter of the law. I'm going to skip this. This is an example of lifnim mishurat hadin relating to a lost item that the Mar Shmuel says you have to give the lost item back to its original owner, even though you're not legally obligated to, if he comes and shows that it really is his, because that obligation flows from this concept of lifnim mishurat hadin, even if the strict halacha, the strict Jewish law, does not require it. And this Talmudic text says, in fact, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed because courts in Jerusalem were adjudicating cases on the basis of strict law and did not go beyond it. They did not practice the law of lifnim mishurat hadin. They did not practice this concept of going beyond the letter of the law. So it really has an existential dimension, that the fate of the Jewish people, and certainly the fate of worship of God, was shaped by our, at the time, by Jewish unwillingness to go beyond the strict letter of the law. And finally, another concept that sort of muddies the waters for us in terms of standards. Nachmanides, in commenting on the verse in Leviticus, or the clause, "You shall be holy," kedoshim to you, basically says the Torah has permitted us all sorts of things, marital relations, eating meat and wine, but we should be moderate and temperate about how we engage in those permitted activities. And thus, we should avoid what happened to sort of the glutton, let's say, who becomes a scoundrel within the permissible bounds of the Torah. So this is another concept, naval birshut haTorah. So we have, on the one hand, lifni mishurat hadin, going beyond the strict letter of the law. And this is another, not or refraining from behavior that we're permitted to engage in by tradition, but that is excessive, that is really beyond the bounds of what God wants of us. And we want to avoid becoming the scoundrel who sort of exploits these permissibilities and these loopholes within the Torah to engage in behavior that is not sacred and that is not prototypically Jewish. So I think the same, I'm introducing, and in passing at the end here, these standards, just to show that the rabbinic inclination to find or to establish precise details sort of butts up against some of these standards that are more amorphous. And one could argue that it creates a sort of a daunting project for us about, well, what do we actually have to engage in order to fulfill the divine mandate to engage in social justice in the world? And having just raised the specter that this is a very daunting project that perhaps has standards that are imprecisely defined and therefore difficult for us to fulfill. So we end up thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't even try because it's all too complicated for me. That is definitely not the Jewish perspective more generally. We are obligated to seek to strive to actualize social justice as best we can. I wanted to include this famous last rabbinic text, which is not directly related to social justice, but I think can be applied to the daunting prospect of trying to fulfill the divine mandate of social justice in the world. Rabbi Tarfon used to say, "It is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it." Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, lo ata ben chorin, and it's usually lehi batel mimena. And it goes on to say that God will repay you for trying to finish the work. That repayment may not happen until the world to come, but be patient. It will come eventually. But I think the rabbis try to be practical and pragmatic and realistic and encouraging about doing the best we can. We have fairly demanding obligations within the Jewish tradition, but we're not entitled to simply throw up our hands and either be sanctimonious about it and say, oh, well, poor people or the marginalized, that's God's will, they deserve to suffer like that. Getting back to what Turnus Rufus, the Roman perspective was, oh, it's God's will that those people suffer. We can't be sanctimonious about identifying the divine will in that way. And we also can't throw up our hands and resign ourselves to passivity and inaction because we think the project, the enterprise of social justice is too daunting. We may not be obliged to finish the job, but we are certainly not at liberty to neglect our obligation to do the best we can, both as individuals and as Jewish communities. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I know we're running a little late, but if anyone has any thoughts or questions in conclusion, Please, you're welcome to raise your hand. Yes, Benjamin.
I've been, from the very outset, I've been following and sort of taking notes about my question as to why you chose to call this, to use the phrase social justice. And when I look back at your, the little paragraph that I expect you must have written for the email, you admitted that social justice is a cutting edge agenda item in modern society, blah, blah, blah. And I don't mean to say blah, 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 it wasn't important, but that the rest is not germane to my question, but that it was problematic for me from the very beginning, or not problematic, but it was my big question as to where you were going to go with this was why that phrase, and whether Judaism, Jewish law itself has something it calls social justice, or whether it's bound up in all of these other things. And then at the very end, you got to the part where, you really sort of answered that question with those last 3 or 4 sources. And I would love to, I hope that will be in the source sheet that will come in the next email, as you showed in today's email, you had last week's source sheet. So I hope I'll be able to look back at that, because that really says to me so much of the answer to my own question. And I don't think it's immaterial here, which is that if there's anything that's, I kept asking why for social justice, because isn't everything you've been talking about just, and I don't mean mere, but isn't it just justice? Doesn't justice in Jewish law and in Jewish culture mean all of the things that you've described as social justice, taking care of the marginalized and those who can least help themselves and all the rest of that? And yet it seems that even if it is, that the real way to accomplish that is to sort of go this extra mile that those few sources at the end spoke about, and that just following the law may not accomplish, it may not solve or resolve the issue as to whether everybody is taken care of. And that to me is like, just my head exploded there, because I thought that that's really sort of the most exciting part of it, and a way that I would hope to answer what I think is funny to me in this being a cutting edge thing. The phrase that exists now and that we hear in current events always seems funny to me, because I sort of think, what is social justice? What does that mean? It's such an ambiguous thing, and you can, different organizations name it, call it, enumerate different criteria for what that amounts to. But in where I come from, in the Jewish, it's just something that we do, and it's bound justice. Social justice is bound up with justice, bound up with the way that we should be living.
Benjamin, I got I understand the gist of your question, which is in comments which are very good. So I'll address them both. I guess I generally agree with you, but I'm gonna express some disagreement with one aspect of your comments. We all know that social justice, as you referenced, is discussed in many different contexts in today's society. I used the phrase social justice to try to sort of exploit that prevalence. I agree with you that in the Jewish tradition, there's no, and I think I said this last time, there's no real delineation between social justice and establishing justice and righteousness, within our social frameworks. It's really the same thing. I was exploiting the fact that everyone's talking about it these days, and I wanted to invite people to attend, because I wanted to convey the Jewish tradition has a lot to say about that. So yes, I acknowledge that social justice doesn't have a special meaning in Jewish thought, but the contemporary invocation of that term that I described, you say correctly, as cutting edge, is millennia old within the Jewish tradition. So yes, I think they're roughly equivalent. There are many dimensions, contexts, and aspects of social justice, or or of justice and righteousness in society. One aspect of your comments that I'll deviate from. Like you, I'm very interested in the last few texts about Lifnim Meshurat Adin and going beyond the letter of the law and avoiding being a scoundrel. But what I'll disagree with is I don't think those especially define the parameters of sort of social justice.
Okay.
They complicate our mandate, and they're very interesting. It's a very interesting topic of whether there is an ethical realm within Judaism that exists independently of Jewish law, meaning this Lifnim Mishurat Adin realm of needing to go beyond the strict letter of the law creates a whole murky realm to which we're subject by the tradition that extends beyond Jewish law. And there's a famous essay, I may focus on this next year, but there's a famous essay by Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who is a brilliant rabbi, student of many famous rabbis, including Rav Soloveitchik, and he actually became Rav Soloveitchik's son-in-law, had a PhD in English literature from Harvard, and later became the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Har Tzion, which is considered the Harvard of yeshivas in Israel. He wrote a famous essay saying, is there an ethic of a Jewish obligation to be ethical that is independent of halacha? That's not the precise title, but it's a good paraphrase. And that's a debated question. And it introduces a very sort of interesting realm of discussion about whether we have to, and by the way, Lichtenstein's answer was no, it doesn't exist. It's within the fabric of, within the universe of halacha, is this mandate to go beyond it. So just I'm deviating from comments just in that sense that I think social justice is all that we've been discussing. And these last few texts introduce a complication that deserves its own discussion, that is both interesting and challenging.
I hope you can make a reference just to that essay when you make your source sheet. Thank you.
Hold on, let me. By the way, I will include my this source sheet with the next link. The title is, Does Jewish Tradition Recognize an Ethic Independent of Halacha? And it was written a few decades ago, but it has spurred a lot of discussion about the limitations or bounds of Jewish law and whether we have to look beyond it for advice about how we're supposed to act.
Great.
Any other questions or comments?
As always, thank you.
Okay. So
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you,
That was-
everyone. I
that was
appreciate your joining me, and I apologize for the abbreviated nature of this course. I hope very much that we are able to gather together in person next spring, and that I can see all of your faces in closer detail when we gather in the Beit Midrash.
Or at least our
May
feet.
it be so.
Yes.
Thank
And
you,
Yehi
Mark.
Ratzon. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Have a good one, everybody.